Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session in a four-part webinar series to discuss the challenges and explore solutions exclusively for the media. My name is Kavita Chandran, and I'm your host this evening. I'm a writer, an author, moderator, and journalism trainer based in Singapore. And I'm also a professor of journalism and communications at some universities here. I've been in newsrooms for about 20 years, mostly as a financial journalist with CNBC, Bloomberg, and Reuters across the United States and Asia. It is my pleasure to be moderating this webinar today, which is brought to you by the Asian Development Bank and Thomson Reuters Foundation. I have to make a quick disclaimer here that all views and opinions that are expressed here by our amazing guest speakers are their own and do not represent those of ADB and TRF. So the webinar series aims to strengthen media coverage on a range of development issues that we will be speaking about. And also we're going to be addressing concerns that are faced by journalists themselves. As you all know, one of the most pressing issues is around climate action. And that's going to be our focus today as we discuss the topic around building resilience. What can we do better in terms of educating and informing the world about the climate crisis and the green transition? What kind of coverage is missing? What are we doing brilliantly? And what else can be done better? So Asia is often cited by experts as being one of the most vulnerable and threatened regions when it comes to climate change. There's much to be done, as you know, from carbon emissions to coal cutting back and transitioning to clean energy, etc., all of which you must have heard during COP26 as well. But of course, there's lots more to be discussed that goes beyond policies and actions, such as migration of people, such as women and climate action, or even global north versus global south and how news is covered on climate change. So there's a lot coming today. The format of the webinar is going to be this. Let me quickly run you through this. We'll start by listening to each of the speakers, and then we'll follow that up with a panel discussion that I will lead. And then I will take your questions, you as in the audience. You're going to be putting your questions in the Q&A section that you see below on your screen. The chat function, I'm afraid, is disabled for you and will only be used by the host to make announcements or insert any information that you need. Again, a reminder that this event is being recorded and it will be available on ADB and TRF platforms later. So we're going to start with calling our first speaker for today, Laurie Goring. For those of you who know her, she is the climate editor at Thomson Reuters Foundation. If you haven't signed up for those newsletters, please do. For those of you who know Laurie, you would have probably read her stories on Thomson Reuters Foundation website. She edits the website on human impacts of climate change, and it's an award-winning website, by the way, which is actually her baby. Laurie manages a team of freelance writers in the developing world from sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, many of them in the most climate vulnerable parts of the globe, all the way from Bangladesh to Zimbabwe, basically those of you in the front line. So previous to Thomson Reuters Foundation, Laurie was a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune, and she's worked out of Brazil, Cuba, Mexico, South Africa, India, as well as UK, and she's also spent time in Afghanistan and Iraq. So basically, here's the interesting thing. Laurie has worked in 80 countries worldwide. So that's amazing. Anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here, Laurie. Thank you for accepting the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to hearing you and how you've seen climate stories change in the remarkable career that you've had. I'm going to hand this over to you, Laurie.
Thanks so much. Yes, I've been covering climate change, I think about as long as anybody doing journalism these days now. It's been almost 20 years since I did the first story that talked about it. And it was interesting at that time because climate change was still something that we were talking about as a future problem that we were kind of seeing the beginning hints of. And for me, that was in South Africa. I was living there. And I went out to an area called the Karoo that's very deserty in the in the Northern Cape province up near Namibia to look at these very interesting trees that are kind of a giant aloe called quiver trees. And the problem that the people in this Richtersveld National Park were seeing was that as it was getting a bit warmer, these trees were not coping. It was already very hot there, and they were starting to die and have difficulties moving. In some cases there, and in other parts in South Africa, things were starting to try to move out of the reserves that they were being conserved in. And it was really a problem. And it was the first time I saw climate change on the ground. And I thought, wow, this is really real. This is not something that people are just talking about that's a future problem. It's actually happening right now. And now, I mean, 20 years later, we look around and all of us can see this problem, right? You know, I mean, if you're not seeing it in your community or in your country, you're seeing it on the television and in places that are starting to feel a little bit close to where you live. So you'd think that we'd all be covering climate change now as a big problem and covering it effectively, but there's still some barriers to doing that. I mean, not least, I think it's sometimes still hard to sell this story to editors. And I remember years ago when I worked at the Chicago Tribune back in the United States, that there was flooding on the upper Mississippi River. And I kept calling my editors and saying, you know, there's a lot of really bad flooding on the upper Mississippi, and it's going to get down to where we are, and it's going to be a serious problem. And they were like, well, let's just wait and see. And then came the day when they called me in a panic and said, it's flooding on the Mississippi. Can you go out there right now and do something about it? And I think climate change can be a little bit like this still, where we're still trying to sell it to editors who are not quite sure how we should be doing this or writing about it, but it's really coming and we can see it. And it would be so much better if we prepared now and made a plan and really started doing this. So I think that the truth is climate change is an enormous story now, but I think the way that you have to sell it to your editors and to your readers is not necessarily as a story about climate change, but a story about what they're interested in. I mean, the truth is climate change is now affecting lots of things people are interested in, whether it's, you know, politics or investing, sports, business, travel, fashion, finance, lifestyle, agriculture. All of those beats for a journalist now have a lot to do with climate change and trying to, you know, do things in a more sustainable way that's good for the climate and nature. Now, fortunately, I think a lot of media are, you know, really figuring out that this is an important story. I mean, you just look at the ads for climate change journalists around the world right now, that we've seen some really major media adding huge numbers of people to cover this issue. So that's one good indication that it's ticking up the agenda. But I find that often for everybody, climate change is still the second worst problem out there. There always seems to be a problem that is more pressing right at the moment. And everybody knows climate change is a big one, but it's second on the agenda. You know, I mean, and it's a problem. Politicians are slow often to act on climate change problems because they see the cost of what they're doing right now and the benefits accruing to some future politician down the road once they're long gone from office, which makes it hard for them. And, you know, people and journalists and others also, I think it tends to sit second on a lot of people's agendas, if not further down. So I guess the question is, how do we get it to the top, which the scientists tell us is where it really should be, because these impacts are going to be very serious, they're going to come fast, and there's real opportunities to try to deal with these things now, to actually create a whole lot of better things in everyone's lives. And you know, how do we get that moved up the agenda? I think the way that you do that is to look for the things that people care about when you write about climate change. There's a climate scientist named Catherine Hayhoe you might be familiar with. She's very good about climate communication. She works in Lubbock, Texas, which is about as ungreen a place as you can imagine in many ways in the United States. In Texas, a big oil state. And she says that what you have to do is really talk to people about what they care about, establish that rapport first, just in a one-on-one kind of situation. So she says, if you're worried about climate change, talk to people in your gardening club or in your ski club or in your, the nursery where you have your kids or anything like that. Because those concerns that you share, that there's new pests in the garden or that your kids are getting allergies a lot earlier in the season, that kind of thing, is the great way to make an entree to talking to people about climate change. And I think she's just right about that. And we need to do that as journalists as well, really think about what it is people care about and then bring climate change into the conversation rather than trying to write purely about climate change and force people to come and read what we're saying. I think that as you try to do good climate change journalism these days, what we're finding is that you need to really write about the things that are working at scale, because it's now so late in the process of trying to deal with this that tiny little pilot projects are not as important as they once were unless there's a chance to really scale those up rapidly. I think we find ourselves writing a lot about what's not happening, which I know for a journalist seems a bit odd, but really writing about the things, what are the barriers? If something clearly should be happening that would help to install clean energy, to reduce risks around disasters, why is that not happening if it's not? Those are often very, very good stories. We're trying to make a really clear picture too, as well, not only of the costs of climate action, but the benefits of climate action, because those too often are overlooked. We talk about using clean energy, it's going to clean up the air, we're going to have lots of benefits, but just plain the benefits of having a stable climate as well, and that are huge. Reliable water, protecting forests to make sure, and nature generally, to make sure that all the systems we depend on for food and air and water are there. I think the other thing we have to start doing is really ditching the jargon around this and realizing that this is not a story for a bunch of scientists or environmental experts. This is a story for everybody. And we need to start writing these stories so your neighbor or your mother or people close around you can really understand them and engage with them. And I think we have to tell this as a people story. I've really, I've had arguments with our social media people at Thomson Reuters Foundation, because we sometimes talk about saving the planet in our tweets and so on. I keep saying it is about that, but that's not really the important thing. The important thing is we're trying to save people. Because if the planet's not operating, that is bad news for us. We don't operate independent of it. So we need to keep telling people stories and really taking people to the front line and let them see for themselves what's going on and draw their conclusions about it. And I think that we also are at this interesting moment right now because of this Ukraine-Russia war and COVID-19 as well, where some of the impacts that we're seeing on supply chains, on food security, and these kind of things, we can see what happens when there's disruption and upheaval in international systems. And those are all lessons that for what's going to come with climate change. So it really is this chance to draw these parallels and begin to show where things need to change in order to keep us all safe in the years to come. I think I'll stop there for now, and really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I will get you back in a few minutes, but I did like the point you mentioned about stories that target people and trying to save people as opposed to just focusing on trying to save the planet. So we will be talking about climate literacy as well, folks. I'm going to now invite our next guest. Laji Poiva Sherelle Jackson is another news person that we have here with us today. She goes as Sherelle. Sherelle is a Samoan journalist. She writes and she edits for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, where she covers climate, chemicals, and oceans processes. Sherelle, welcome to the show. Very, very happy that you are here. Your work focuses on environment, gender, and human rights in small island developing states, with a particular focus on the way international media covers the climate crisis in the islands. Sherelle has worked for AP, AFP, and Al Jazeera. She currently writes for The Guardian, is also the editor of Pacific Environment Weekly. Talofa Sherelle. I'm not sure if I got that.
Talofa, Kavita, how are you?
Very good, thank you. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us, Sherelle. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your take on how climate is covered by journalists in different parts of the world. So please take it away with your presentation. Thank you.
My name is Langipoiva, and I am originally from Savai'i in the South Pacific. I've been working as a journalist for close to 20 years. So in the Pacific, we always acknowledge those who came before us, especially the guardians of the land and the ancestors who paved the way for us. And in my story, I always want to acknowledge my mother, the late High Chief Silifiti Molangi Jackson, who is an Indigenous conservation leader, but also someone who was very passionate about culture and protecting our lands. If we can go to the next slide. Now, I've characterized the coverage of climate change as it relates to the Pacific Islands in these stages. And the first stage is that it wasn't prioritized by the global North media. And the second stage is once it was covered, the global North media recognized the problem and started covering it from a Western perspective, utilizing images of polar bears, ice caps, and you name it, images and a narrative that we couldn't connect with as Pacific Islanders. And then the narrative changed to global North media realized that indeed there are islands in the South Pacific and that we were facing direct impacts of climate change. Now, then there was this over-reporting of doom and gloom, but still with this twist of that was more palatable to the West. And, you know, often we see pictures of Bangladesh, and it was usually very, it's very tragic in the way that it's depicted. And that was the same way that Pacific Islands were depicted whenever they were. If we can go to the next slide. So I developed this earlier as a way to look at the differences between the coverage of Pacific Islands experiencing climate change and also the participation of Pacific Islands at COP26 by the global media and then the Pacific media. And when I say global media, I mean global North. So we tended to see references that were referred to the Pacific Islands as quaint or tiny or, you know, in amusing contexts and references. And also there was the usual, oh, the islands are sinking, helpless, you know, populations. And, you know, it was very disempowering language and angles. Whereas the way that Pacific media covered the participation of Pacific Islands in COP26 really looked at the national focus. We looked at issues that were affecting our islands and our national governments. There were pictures of Pacific leaders who were smiling at the COP and their participation. And there was a lot of empowering language, and countries, we covered our own countries like real countries, not like small, interesting, quaint countries in the middle of nowhere. So if we can go to the next slide. These are just some highlights of my coverage. The most recent piece that I worked on is The Impossible Choice, which is a podcast series by The Guardian. And I'd want to delve deeper into this. It was called The Impossible Choice. Now, this was an initiative of the Pacific editor of The Guardian, Ms. Kate Lyons, who is based out of Australia. And there were about 20 of us Pacific journalists involved in this story in one way or another, either fixer and also brought in our sources. We spoke to people in at least 5 Pacific Island countries. and with direct interviews in local languages of people who had already migrated due to climate change and those who were planning to. This was such a compelling story, and it was a really important one to be a part of. Because as a Pacific Islander, it was actually the first major news project I've been a part of where my voice as a Pacific Island journalist really mattered. And those who were making the decisions in the newsroom really took into account and respected my guidance on cultural nuances and local nuances that needed to be taken into consideration. Because there is often a narrative that Western media pushes when they cover islands. And this narrative is usually very disempowering. With this podcast and this series, my editor was really clear that they would take the direction from me in terms of what is appropriate and what is relevant on the ground in the Pacific. So some highlights from this project is that representation really matters. Representation in terms of having Pacific Island journalists as part of your production team, in the planning process, in the script writing, really does matter, because those lenses are really important in any story. Same way that you cover any country in the global South, this is something that you also owe to the Pacific Islands when you do cover stories in the Pacific. Like I said, disempowering language comes naturally in coverage of the Pacific. I experienced something in the production of this particular story that was very telling. We had interviewed one of our journalists on the ground in Papua New Guinea, was interviewing a paramount chief. Now, a paramount chief is, in my view, higher than the queen in our cultural context. You are born, I guess it is in the same line in Western understanding. But a paramount chief holds this mana and this seniority within cultural context in Papua New Guinea, and indeed across the Pacific, where the chiefly system operates. And in the script writing that I discussed with my colleague, who is white and from Australia, she wrote the script and referred to the paramount chief as, said, who is a paramount chief there? And the reference was very casual in the way that this paramount chief was addressed and where this paramount chief came from. And then I stopped and I rewrote the script and I said, paramount chief, full name from the island of, full name of the island, and the tribe and the country. And she pulled me up and she said, we don't necessarily need to do that. And I said, well, would you say the queen there or the king there? And she sat there and she was like, yeah, that's a really good point. And those are things that would easily slip through in the way that the Pacific is covered that may not necessarily have been caught or changed if I, as a Pacific Islander, was not involved in that process. So it is a small example, but it is an example of how this type of language and these types of approaches will continue as long as the global North continue to hold the decision-making powers within the newsrooms. And as long as the lenses and newsrooms are held by those in the global North, issues that are faced by those in the front lines will not necessarily be reflected accurately or to the full extent that it should. So the balancing the grief, reality, and empowerment is a good one. Okay, so I moved on to the next one. So I'll just stay on this slide. Balancing grief, reality, and empowerment was for me a challenge in that one because I was part of the story that we were telling, but it was an important story in that I could relate to everyone that I was speaking to, because when they referred to cyclones, to trying to survive, to trying to save relatives. It's something that I had also experienced. So it was much easier to relate and to tell that story. We can move on. Thank you. Representation in climate research also matters when, when you are doing research on the Pacific Islands. It's always good to have someone on the ground so that we could also share our perspectives and the realities of the challenges that we face in reporting climate change. You go to the next one. I know this time constraint. So some tips, pretty straightforward. Make sure to involve Pacific Island journalists and outlets. Steer clear of disempowering language. Understand the nuances on the ground. And that understand that we don't look at climate change the same way that the Global North editor or the Global North journalist does. And let Pacific Islanders tell their own stories. Don't tell it for us. Next slide. And I always like to end with tributing the research, the work of the new and upcoming climate journalists in the Pacific. And I want to, introduce and highlight the work of my Samoan colleague, Mark, who has just started writing on climate stories in the past 3 years, and has covered some amazing stories on the ground, on the front lines on climate change. So Kavita, thank you so much for your patience, and to the team at TRF, and I do apologize for the technical difficulties we had earlier. Faftai.
No worries. Thank you very much, Shirel. Thanks for all your pertinent points, especially about media coverage on the climate crisis in small and remote areas and how it's covered internationally. During my trainings, I've had discussions with journalists in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and other coastline areas, and this completely resonates with them too. So we can discuss more on this later during the panel discussion, and I'll see you back here for that. Thanks again. Gentle reminder for folks that this webinar is on the record, so look out for story ideas if you're a journalist, especially from our next speaker, who has an abundance of knowledge and information about climate adaptation. Some of you probably know him or have attended or watched his TED Talks. This is Dr. Parag Khanna that I'm talking about. Parag is a leading global strategy advisor. He's a world traveler and best-selling author. He's the founder and managing partner of Future Map, a data and scenario-based strategy advisory firm. Parag's newest book, if you haven't seen it or got your hands on it, is called Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. It just came out last year. The one before that, which I am excited to say that I actually read for the second time ahead of this webinar, is called The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. Just brilliant stuff. There's a lot that you can find on YouTube by Parag and his TED Talk, so please do listen in attentively. Parag also writes frequently in various publications. He was named one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century by Esquire magazine, and he's also been featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. So it is indeed such a pleasure to have you here with us, Parag. I'm going to hand over to you. I know you have a wonderful presentation for us. Thank you.
So let me just share a few points here. The first is to kind of lay out the case, right, for why Asia matters here. Let's remember that in purchasing power parity terms, Asia is more than half of the entire world economy. And therefore, clearly, even as a region that has traditionally been characterized as so-called emerging markets, well, Asia has emerged, Asia has ascended. And of course, this not only means that it's the majority in and of itself of the entire world economy, it of course is also the driver of the fastest growing driver of greenhouse gas emissions, if not representing the majority of current global emissions today. So when we talk about issues that relate to industrial output and the ways in which emissions and consumption of energy and so forth impact climate change. Again, when we look at this from the perspective of financial markets and regulation and who are the countries driving the agenda, too often, Asia is not put front and center because it isn't at the front and center of significant regulation of certain industries. It's not at the center or forefront of some of the financial industry regulations around climate or emissions disclosures and these kinds of things. So that whole sector of again financialized kinds of activity and conversations on climate change is something where Asia has been slow to sort of pick up the mantle, and yet, of course, that means that when we focus on everything that's happening in the FTSE or the New York Stock Exchange or coming out of the SEC and these guidelines, we're largely talking about firms that may be seen to be more or less on board with climate mitigation measures, whereas in Asia, that's not at all true or apparent. And that, again, makes Asia the economic and the emissions kind of ground zero for the world. Corollary to all of this, as I mentioned, the size of the economy, the scale of the geography, and the demographics, because again, it's not just most of the world economy that's in Asia, but most of the world population literally lives inside this rectangle. This here actually would represent about close to 55 or 60% of the entire human population lives inside this map, and probably always will. Now, again, if you think about the volume of infrastructure investment in the world globally, $3 to $4 trillion a year, the majority of that is happening in Asia. But of course, that means that with climate change, you'll have more stranded assets, more infrastructure at risk than any other part of the world. So what I'm showing you here, for example, this is kind of my rendering of Belt and Road. Imagine if all of the railways, pipelines, internet cables, electricity grids, and so forth are laid down. These are some of the lattice of infrastructure that will emerge. Critical here, of course, is coastal urbanization, right? Because so much of that infrastructure is in Asia's coastal mega cities, which are, of course, the largest in the world. And if you think about climate effects, those will affect Asians more and Asian infrastructure more than any other part of the world. If you look at the human geography of the planet, I mentioned already most of the human population lives in Asia. You can see on this map just the distribution of individuals in the world. So 8 billion pixels on this map. Of course, China and India being the most populous countries in the world. Now, if you kind of layer in what climate models are telling us in terms of the suitability, right? What you've just seen here in the last 5 seconds emerge is the layering in of the suitability index, and the suitability index ranks geographies in a very sort of geospatial way according to whether or not their suitability for human habitation will increase or decrease as temperatures rise. And clearly you can see that a large swath of Asian geography, not to say nothing, of course, of other very important, all continents are important, but very important regions of the world as well, that are heavily populated, are becoming increasingly red over time. Whereas ironically, and it's not the main subject of our conversation today, but I think it is worth discussing, is that the zones that are green here on this map are the places that climate scientists are telling us are becoming more suitable for human habitation. And just these 2 slides, if I could, sort of dispense with the 1,600 slides that I've been making over the years and be left with 2, I would pick these 2. I can think of no more perverse misalignment of our layers of geography in the world than the misalignment between our human geography, our physical distribution, our geographic distribution around the world, and this map showing that the places that are actually becoming depopulated, that have shrinking populations, especially OECD countries, Northern
Folks, I think we lost Parag over there. Let's just give it 3 seconds. There you are. Parag, sorry, we lost you there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Is it okay?
You're fine. You're back on. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll continue. So we're saying this is such an incredible moral outrage, if you will, at a planetary scale, and there is no roadmap for this given to us by the United Nations or the Biden administration or anyone for that matter. And this is the grand challenge, if you will, or wicked problem, all of these terms, cliches that we hear all the time. I can think of no grander challenge. I can think of no more wicked problem than the need for the 8 billion human beings in the world today, eventually 9 billion, to resort ourselves in light of the inevitabilities of climate change. And again, there is absolutely no master plan for this. Asia, as I set out at the beginning to emphasize, is the region that is going to be the most affected. Largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, largest number of people who are poor and therefore vulnerable, and by any metric, most people exposed, as you see here in the lower right, to sea level rise and so forth. All of this is in Asia. So Asians need to care more than others. And because the solutions are not coming from, or even if they are coming from other countries, they are insufficient, Asians need to wake up to this data and this reality and realize that they are a driver of climate change and they are the primary victims of climate change. And they therefore must take the bull by the horns and adapt much more quickly. Kavita mentioned my previous book, The Future is Asian, and I get asked all the time, what will derail the Asian story? And I say the lack of any common, collective, environmental governance mechanism. There isn't one. Right? There are innovators in climate technology, right? Hydrogen power, nuclear power, wind power, solar. We have innovators in Asia, especially wealthy countries, whether it's Japan, Australia, China, but we don't have regional diplomatic mechanisms to subsidize and transfer the technology that's needed to make Asian societies and economies more sustainable. And that is going to be one of the critical coping mechanisms and adaptation mechanisms. Speaking of adaptation, well, I'll jump over a little bit. This is just in some of my work, I look at the geographies that I feel are going to become the climate oases of the future. Now, I use this term somewhat guardedly. I don't want to guarantee that if you move to Kirkenes, Norway, that you'll enjoy perfect quality of life, or the Great Lakes region, or the Rocky Mountains, or parts of Western Europe, and so forth. But what I have done is to look at places that I do feel not only have the climate resilience, which is again a relative observation, relative compared to other places, but more or less something that is factual, but also have the capacity to absorb greater populations, to diversify their economies, and to undertake the kinds of political adaptations potentially that might be necessary as climate migration accelerates into the future. So we can certainly speak more specifically about any of these places that I've tried to document, their adaptation. As emphasize this upon what's happening in Asia or the impact on Asia, emphasize here that mitigation and adaptation have not been treated climate diplomacy thus far. Mitigation has gotten the lion's share of attention. Our summitry, again, the COP process is very much focused on pressuring countries, companies, and other actors to decarbonize supply chains, to focus on renewable energy generation. And there's even more talk at a global level around geoengineering projects and so forth. And all of that is, again, existentially necessary. Of course, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want to reduce any and all, negative impact that we have on our ecosystems and the environment. And indeed, clearly that is where the emphasis lies, because more than 90% of total climate-related spending is going into mitigation. But let's face it, based upon everything I've just shown you, we also have to adapt. The climate, many people don't appreciate, is a complex adaptive system. We're very accustomed to speaking in terms of, benchmarks and timetables and key performance indicators. And, if we hold temperatures down to 1.8 degrees versus 2 degrees, we can avert this and avert that. That may or may not be true, but I'll tell you this, even if you keep temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, the climate does not snap back to the familiar climate that you knew in the year 1990, or what was the case in 1900 or even 1800. Complex systems don't work that way. They never ever return to any previous state. Every day, now and forever into the future, the climate will be different than what it was. And that applies almost everywhere in the world. And therefore, we have to adapt to it. It will not adapt to us. Places where, that are stricken by drought, mega drought, where the climate has effectively, irrevocably changed, are not suddenly going to receive massive amounts of rainfall the year after we reduce emissions to zero, if and when that ever happens, which is of course not likely to be the case in any meaningful time frame. And therefore, I believe that equal attention needs to be given to adaptation. And adaptation is not a challenge for tomorrow or the day after, it's yesterday and today. The number of people who are already displaced by climate-related phenomena equals the number of people displaced by through economic dislocation or political violence. And it's not getting enough attention. And the adaptation measures that we need to undertake every single day are not getting enough funding, enough support, enough attention. So that could be climate proofing of coastal areas, of cities, and new kinds of infrastructure. Earlier resettlement. It's in domestically as well as internationally.
Sorry, Parag, we seem to be having trouble
ever
hearing you
at
again.
an international. Oh,
sorry, Parag, you're breaking.
Oh, so how about now? Is it better?
That's better.
Is it better now?
That's better now.
What I will do, let me temporarily turn off my video and just stick to the slides for just a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Shall I do that?
Okay. We'll go right into panel discussion as soon as you're finished. Great. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Last couple of points. So, the one thing you will never hear at any intergovernmental conference is the words population resettlement. I mean, you might, but it's not going to be a central issue, because sovereign governments are premised on the idea, of course, of controlling their own borders, and of course the right of people to move across those borders. So I don't think that you will really ever have this all-important issue of population relocation resettlement emerge as strongly as it needs to emerge on the international diplomatic agenda, and I find that unfortunate. And therefore, we're left to think about or speculate about what the future migration patterns in the world are going to be as a result of everything from climate change to political unrest, economic dislocation, technological disruption, and so forth, all of which are operating in parallel, simultaneously colliding with and reinforcing each other. So what I'm showing you here is this sort of stable patterns of interregional migration that have characterized the world in the last 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can see that actually movement within the former Soviet republics, from Latin America into North America, within Africa, South Asians into the Gulf region, and so forth, have been the largest vectors of migration. And in my work, I speculate about what comes next. Where will the future populations reside in the year 2030, 2040, and 2050? Who will live where, why, and how did they get there? And from where to where? Those are the big questions that I'm tackling. And in my recent work, I've been looking at the growing populations of South Asians and Southeast Asians into Central Asia and North Asia, again, the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, and so forth. South Asian and East Asian populations migrating westward, if you will, along the new Silk Roads and relocating to Europe and other areas of Western Eurasia. And of course, African populations trying to cross the Mediterranean, the fate of Arab populations in West Asia, and so forth, in order to speculate around where they might move in the future. And I see early signs of some new vectors of migration that literally we have never seen before, such as the ones I mentioned in terms of South Asian populations drifting northward and so forth. So let me just stop right there and hope that that just stimulates a bit of conversation amongst the panel. Thank you again so much.
Thank you so much, Parag. Fascinating stuff, especially the depopulation in green zones. Amazing. So lots of questions are coming in, and we'll take them soon after our short panel discussion. Parag, if you could come back on, and may I request Sherelle and Laurie to please come back on screen. Okay. So wonderful. Welcome back, everyone, and great insights. Thanks for all your comments and thoughts. I'm going to start with a very newsroom specific question, and Sherelle and Laurie, for you, and Parag, please do feel free to add your thoughts too, if you'd like. And Laurie, you mentioned climate literacy at one point, and that was one of the questions I had in mind as well. What can be done to improve climate literacy in newsrooms, or even among journalists themselves?
I think that we have to, people who understand climate change tend to slip into a lot of jargon around it that we don't even really accept. And I would say, you know, to Parag's point, even terms like mitigation and adaptation, so many people don't understand. So I think as much as we can, it's really stepping back from the terms and just talking about what's actually happening. Because people they do understand migration, they do understand risk from floods or from droughts or things like that. And I think that really helps with your audience as well. You know I'm always interested when we have freelance writers that turn in a piece, and if they ask people about climate change in remote areas, they often haven't heard of that. And of course they haven't, unless there's an NGO there that's been kind of putting the terms in their head. But if you ask anyone about erratic weather or about patterns that you're used to not being there anymore, those they understand. And so I think we have to really we have to get out of our little bubble of climate change speak if we want to talk to a much, much broader audience, which is what we need to do now. Because to try to educate people so they really understand this problem, they understand the risks and the opportunities and what's going to need to happen, and they feel the need for action, however that is, whether that's taking action in their own lives, pushing politicians and others for action, they have to understand what's going on, so we can help them with that.
Yeah. Sherelle?
I like Laurie's point on understanding climate change on the ground. And this is certainly the same for Pacific Island communities, and certainly in my coverage. When you pose the question to someone who's experiencing climate change at the local level, and you frame it as, you know, has climate change affected your life? Say, for instance, in the Samoan language, you know, they will say, no, everything's been fine. Climate change has not affected me and my family. But when you frame it within the nuances of the climate science and the impacts of climate change on islands, so for instance, how was your fish catch 2 years ago compared to now? They'll be like, you know, it's taking me 3 days to catch this year. Whereas last year, I could still get maybe 3 or 4 fish within the hour. So, but you have to kind of have that extra understanding of how climate change truly impacts livelihoods of those on the ground in order to frame the questions within the context of their understanding. And there's also the issue of translation. So all across the Pacific, we translate climate change in phrases. And in some cases, it takes 2 sentences for climate change to be translated. And, you know, that's a bit of a mouthful, especially if you have very short, especially for radio. I think for print, we're fine, we can work with it, but for radio, that's a whole other situation.
And I think interestingly, Laurie, I think you touched on it as well, that climate should not be a beat per se. You know, it just cuts across beats, right, in newsroom. So it could be a sports guy writing about how cricket pitches are getting spoiled because of rainfall, or it could be, you know, it doesn't have to be a section in a newspaper or something that's dedicated to the environment. So I think, Laurie, I think you mentioned that as well earlier.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's touching everything we care about now for everyone, everywhere. You know, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a skier, whether you you know, you like to garden and or you are worried about health issues around this. You know, heat is such an enormous and really fast-growing threat to people. And we you know, we barely have begun to write about those kind of risks. I mean, most people don't realize that in many parts of the world, heat kills more people than almost anything else. And it has for years, actually. It's just that the deaths are very rarely attributed to heat itself, but instead to the impacts that you see as a result of that. And so kind of shining a light on these things now, you know, helping people, for instance, understand how much the heat risk is increasing and the things that they can do to mitigate that, and also what communities can do in a larger sense to mitigate that is really important now, because you want to have those measures in place before the heat gets much worse, not after, and when the problem is much bigger.
Yeah, and to your point, that's how people understand. That's how it becomes a people story as well, right? I just want to move on to Parag, because I know you write as well, Parag, but you know, my question was, in your book, The Future's Agent, which by the way is right here, you talk about lines that are blurring between Asia and Europe. And then you have your latest book, Move, where you also focus on mobility and migration, and a lot of which you've explained beautifully, especially through your last few slides. As someone who's, I know you write, but you're also an observer of media. Is there an untold story, Parag, by the media here about this whole move that you're talking about due to climate adaptation?
I guess the answer is that either there are many, you know, such stories, but perhaps if you're looking for a leitmotif or a particular arena or demographic that is a huge story that isn't getting enough attention, you know, I'll mention a couple. Let me drill down on the South and Southeast Asian populations that are emigrating outward. Now, India in particular, and South Asia in general, is the most populous region of the world by far. By far. Already India has as many people as China. And if you add in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, of course, you have as a sub-region, the most populous region of the world. It's also younger, far younger demographically, right, than East Asia, including China. You know, the median age of India is more than 10 years younger than that of China, for example. And as you saw from the previous map, the climate scenario for India is about as bad as for any country on the planet Earth, which is a very, you know, just sort of horrific scenario, given the fact that the population is so large and the climate scenario so dire. So it stands to reason that there will be ever larger number of climate migrants within or outside of India. And you know, the causes of migration are manifold, and I try to categorize them, such as, again, politics, climate, economics, technology, identity, and so forth. But I try not, even though they're categories, I try not to neatly separate them. People could move for many reasons. They could say, you know, I'm fed up with the climate, but I also don't like the politics, right? Both of those things can be true at the same time. But in terms of a real visual vector, it is in fact the South Asians moving northward into Central Asia. You know, and when I wrote about this, I called it the reverse Mughal Empire, right? Now, all of us who are of South Asian descent can appreciate this, probably even in a hereditary way. We may even trace our lineage to the Mughal dynasty moving southward from Central Asia, from the Fergana Valley, to conquer, colonize, you know, South Asia 500 years ago, beginning with the Emperor Babur. Well, so the fact that now South Asians are moving northward in such you know, visible numbers, if you spend time, as I do, some of my favorite places are Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so forth, I just have witnessed over more than 20 years of continuous travel to these countries, ever more South Asian populations. And they're being recruited, actually, given their skills and the mismatch in the construction sector, medical sector, English teachers, nurses, you name it. So I think that that is actually a really interesting story. And to some degree, it may mean, oh, I have to travel to, Uzbekistan to cover a story about Indian migrants and, in there and in Kazakhstan, but it's a very interesting story. And those populations will grow and grow and grow. There's historical connections and there's affinities, there's economic complementarities. There are many things that are helping this transpire, and it's happening very peacefully, I might add. Bear in mind that just, obviously when we think about Russia right now, we have other things on our mind, but Russia has just signed a skills partnership with India to import Indian farmers and workers in the agricultural sector more broadly, including food processing and so forth. This was what Putin had in mind when he invited Modi to be the guest of honor at the Eastern Eurasian Economic Summit again in 2019, just a couple of years ago. So there is that demographic blending and again transfer that is taking place. And it is a huge story. It is, again, the largest movement of peoples on Earth in the coming decades will be Asians moving from south to north. It is not Africans crossing to Europe, right? Again, anytime there's a demographic story in the world, it must center on Asia. Asia is 10 times more people than any other region of the world. So we have to actually tell these stories. Now, I just want to highlight just one more thing, because I think it's so important. It is the professional, if you will, just the sectoral composition. So farmers, nurses. I spend a fair bit of time in this book, talking about how, given the demand for Filipino nurses in the world as northern countries age, right? There is a competition in China, in Japan, in Europe, the Emirates, Singapore, Canada, America. Every country seems to want Filipino nurses, but guess what? There aren't nearly enough. The world is now really aging, and the Philippines is diminishing in its supply of Filipino nurses. So the next place from which the stock of largely female, as you can understand, nurses are going to be from South Asia. So you're going to have millions, not thousands, millions, literally millions of Indian nurses that have to be trained to go out and live in the aging societies of the world for the next 10, 20 years. Now, it's partially a climate story, it's a politics story, it's an economic story, it's a gender story. It's all of those things at once. And they'll be going to places that are more climate resilient, because that's also where populations will be moving and resettling. So there is a climate angle there as well. But just to emphasize again, the Indian diaspora has been second to the Chinese diaspora. But owing to climate change, economics, chain migration, politics, and even geopolitics, the Indian diaspora will be much larger than the Chinese diaspora in the coming 10, 20 years. And that's something that I categorically state in the book, and I document it, and it's not something that anyone's really talking about. And climate will be a major factor behind that expansion.
That's fascinating stuff, Parag, and I hope people are taking notes, because I'm sure they're getting lovely story ideas out of this as well. And we'll circle back, because I do have a question around energy and Ukraine and Russia, because you mentioned it. But I want to take some questions from the audience now. And Laurie, there's a question, I mean, there are lots of questions, but one of the first questions that came was for you. And it's about journalists who vlog on YouTube with beats on climate change. And this person saying that they're doing a great job and they should be funded, or at least given capacity like scholarships to do more. And if that would be possible. And I was just, I just want to add to that about, because we're talking about YouTubers and social media. I read a survey recently which said about 47% of under 21, people who access news, they access it from TikToks and Snapchats and Insta. They get influenced a lot by social media influencers who are telling them about climate. So I think it ties in with this question about the future and where the future generation is getting their news on climate from. They're relying a lot on people who are speaking on TikTok and making videos and sharing with them about the crisis, and how much of that is right, how much of that is wrong, how much should journalists, embrace that as the future of transferring messages and disseminating news.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that there's a whole new generation that gets their news in very different places than I did. And you know, I see that with my own. I have teenage children, and you know, that is, they're not reading newspapers, and they're not looking at news websites. It's coming through the various social media channels. So yes, I completely agree that, and you know, any kind of efforts to ensure that the messages that go out on there are accurate and are answering the right kind of questions that people need is, you know, incredibly valuable. And probably all of the funders for journalism training and that kind of thing need to be focusing a lot more on this. And I would add that this issue of influencers, I think, is really interesting, because what I find is that the traditional, you know, who do people turn to for news around climate change? You know, it's climate scientists, it's things, the kind of people that we have often looked to. But if you want to reach a much broader audience, which is what we need right now, because we need to build the social support for action, the social awareness and education about the problem and the risks and the opportunities, and then the call for action. That's you just need to reach into whole new communities. And I mean, besides social media, the people that influence on there, it's fantastic. I know there was a nice story someone was talking about with in some Chinese culture, wearing used clothes, secondhand clothes, is not a good thing. You don't want to do that. And they, while trying to promote kind of circular economy and lower carbon and less spending on fashion, someone figured out that the best way to do that was to find really big influencers in China, get them to donate their clothes as sort of prizes and different things that were done on social media. And for them to wear these secondhand clothes is something that was very cool and fashionable and something you might want to, you know, emulate. And these are such smart ideas. You know, when you get different people in there to talk about it, they really can shake up the whole dynamic and bring this to the attention of a lot more people.
Yeah, and thrifting becomes cool, and everything that you know that you may have decided is cool now. So why not? Yeah. So, but then the question about funding, I guess there are enough grants that you know, people should look up online, that a lot of news organizations offer as well. There's a very sweet comment for Sherelle, a fellow Pacific Islander has identified with whatever you've said, Sherelle, and has loved your presentation, and is very interested in the analysis of how the global North has covered climate change over time. But just in relation to that, the question is also, it's a personal story for a lot of people such as you, Sherelle. You are from the island of Savai and Samoa. And as you mentioned in your slides, that your mom's been involved in conservation. And there are strong messages that are coming across now. You know, the COP26, the video that went viral of the minister knee-deep, standing on knee-deep water, sending a very strong message about how some parts of the Pacific Islands are shrinking. Just coming back to you, Sherelle, as a reporter with a personal story, and you mentioned being the story while reporting a story. And I know we have reporters here, and I've mentioned Nepal and Bangladesh and other areas, and they sort of are forced to cover something that's a result of industrialization elsewhere, carbon emissions elsewhere. What are some tips that, Sherelle, you could give? And that's one of the questions here as well, that you could give for people who are doing in-house reporting and stories that are read internationally.
Thank you, Kavita. And I think this ties an acknowledgement to my Pacific Island comrade who is in the comment section. This is such an important question, because for those of us who have studied journalism, and for those of us who also learned in the newsroom, on the ground, in the field, you're always taught to be objective, right? You're not part of the story. But the climate story is intrinsically about us in the Pacific. And it's really hard to take yourself out of that story. But at the same time, you have the ethical dilemma of, this is not about you, right? Yet, taking into account the new ways of telling stories, the new platforms of telling stories, so podcasting, YouTube, it's a lot more compelling to have the voice of the person who's experienced it as well. And I take the point that Parag has made on migration. In The Impossible Choice, we spoke to people from the Carteret Islands who've migrated as a result of sea level rise. We spoke to people in Tuvalu, and they told their stories more effectively and in a more compelling manner than you would say a scientist who's quoting numbers about migration. So my tip would be, as a Pacific Islander or as a frontliner, wherever you are covering the story from the global South, this is your story as well. It is the story of your people, of those that you know, and of the future generations of your country and your region. Do justice to it by using your voice as well and the experiences that you have. And I hesitated many, many times of putting my voice in there, but it makes that story stronger. Of course, you should know the parameters of how you do that within, the rules of that specific platform that you're using and under the guidance of your editor. But I would suggest that you push the boundaries, and if the editor pushes back, you push back, because that story is worth telling. And the voice that we use as Pacific Islanders, is very unique. And I want to refer to Parag's narrative on Asia, where, these are the most populated countries who will be affected by climate change. But in the Pacific, we just don't have the numbers. And for a long time, we haven't had the numbers to merit global coverage. And that's a fundamental issue with news coverage, is not enough people are dying in our region to have merited, the Guardian coverage 10, 20 years ago. And so if the numbers in terms of like monetary value of loss of infrastructure, or the numbers in terms of loss of life, it just doesn't register the coverage by global media. So that's why the stories, the nuances, and the human face of climate change for islands like Tokelau, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Republic of Marshall Islands, they actually stand to lose their entire nations. And now, when I say entire, it's not really large nations, it's low-lying islands, but they stand to lose their sovereignty, their statehood, the identities that come with it, the cultural rights, and all of the entitlements to maritime boundaries and their maritime resources. So I think as a Pacific Islander, or those who come from marginalized communities in the global South, including our friends and families from the Caribbean, we are not covered greatly because the stories that we share don't have the numbers that warrant global coverage, but we can give that voice and those nuances that matter. Thank you.
That's great, Sharelle. Thank you. That's a great tip. Parag, a few questions for you. I'm going to club them up. With the migration that you mentioned, will it minimize climate impact, or will it just transfer from countries to countries, the climate challenges? Also, do the migration and population you talked about, which are caused by climate change, what aspects of climate change would majorly contribute to that? So the one is the contribution that forces people to migrate, and the other one is will the climate challenge minimize climate impact, or will it just transfer from one country to another depending on where they're migrating?
Right. Let's take the second question first. It's of course in many ways primary. It really depends on what the climate risk is of a given place. If it's rising sea levels, then of course people will move further inland and upland. If it is fire, then people will move away from those zones. If it's drought, then of course people move away from drought-stricken regions, and flooding, of course, as well. So all of these, heat also. So every single climate risk is a migration driver, depending on where and how acute it is as it unfolds. And there's almost by definition no climate risk that encourages people to stay where they are, right? I mean, it's a null set. So it's quite logical at this point. Every climate risk you can name is a migration driver, all of them, every single one of them. So again, it's just a matter of where. And then I will, so in terms of does it simply exacerbate or relocate the locus of climate change drivers themselves? This is an interesting point because there is a strain of Northern, Western anti-immigrant logic that actually states that we should not allow, we meaning say wealthy OECD countries, should not allow migrants of any kind, whether they're climate migrants or political migrants, to our countries, because then they will become wealthy and they will become large consumers and emitters of greenhouse gases. Therefore, immigration makes climate change worse. I mean, that's morally specious and it's certainly empirically suspect, both at the same time. I doubt I have to clarify why I think it's morally reprehensible to make that argument, but in terms of the economics of it, it doesn't necessarily hold. The marginal person moving from a poor country to a wealthier country is not necessarily going to be buying a big gas guzzling vehicle, right? The person is more than likely going to be a pedestrian services worker in a urban context, in all likelihood, at best. So I don't think that we should be making these kinds of arguments. Clearly, at this point, the volume of emissions that is baked into the atmosphere and the climate change that is already locked in is not going to be undone by reducing the number of migrants from south to north by 100,000, 200,000, or even 5 million. So again, I think that the linkage should not be allowed to be made. People are making it, and we just have to resist it being made at all, because it cannot be articulated in a logical and defensible way, and therefore it shouldn't be allowed to gain the upper hand and gain currency in discourse.
Wow, that's such a great point. Thank you, Parag. And there is a question here about military. So I thought I could club that in with what I was planning earlier to ask, and Laurie and Sherelle, for you as well, because it links to stories that we cover. So I was reading a few stories on LA Times, and the reporter said the story of Russia is essentially a story of energy, and therefore it's a story linked to climate. So I thought it was fascinating to see the link between war, energy, climate. And Parag, I would love to hear your views, but also to Laurie and Sherelle, when sometimes you hear a newsroom saying you shouldn't be calling them energy reporters anymore. They're essentially climate reporters, because there's been a shift in the narrative. So I'd love to hear your views on that as well. But Parag, whatever linkages you can share with us between war and climate would be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, by the way, just on that point, I mean, energy superpowers like Russia are, of course, affected by climate change, given how rapidly temperatures are rising in Russia, the thawing of the Siberian permafrost, the fact that it is now the world's largest wheat producer and exporter. And now, this is 12 years. It was 12 years ago that Russia had a drought in Siberia, a summer drought and very significant forest fires. It was the first time that they had banned wheat exports. And 6 months later, the Arab Spring broke out. And as you know, one of the stories that is being talked about right now is the fact that this is happening again. The exact same countries, Egypt, Tunisia, and others that are heavily dependent on wheat imports, particularly from Russia, are the ones seeing prices rise very significantly, and that is compounding the impact of COVID and the broader, downturn in the global economy for these countries. And it's a very, very dire situation, quite reminiscent of 2011. So there is that linkage between what's happening in energy and emissions and climate change and the economy and supply chains and instability. Right, there are indirect linkages, from point A to point Z there, and it's not the first time. It's not even the first time in recent memory that this has happened. So we're very good at historically reconstructing a complex chain reaction, with the benefit of hindsight. We're not very good at seeing it into the future, though we actually can and should in any of these kinds of situations. So, water scarcity and conflict over water is an obvious case in point. We've heard people talking about water wars and the likelihood of water wars for quite some time, actually, even though talk of water wars fortunately exceeds the number of water wars, which is a good thing because fighting over water doesn't produce more water. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth paying very close attention to what's happening in the Horn of Africa in terms of Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam project and the downstream implications that has for the Egyptian Nile and what it means for Egyptian agriculture and these kinds of things. So there could be conflict there. One of the areas that I have spotlighted in my work that I think really is worth looking at is the relationship between Turkey and its Arab neighbors and Iran as well. Reason being that if you look at these climate models and forecasts and you look at just at heat risk alone, let alone the drought that already afflicts these countries, the fact that, of course, the Syrian civil war is partially attributable to climate change. Let's not forget that it was the droughts in Syria that also pushed a lot of farmers from the Syrian countryside into Damascus, where that led to, of course, partially kindled what became this Syrian civil war of the last 7 or 8 years. So there are climate-related conflict fault lines everywhere. They're actually more domestic than international, but the international ones are systemically relevant, like, of course, the Mekong River, Brahmaputra River, Indus River system conflict tensions between China and its downstream neighbors in Southeast Asia, as well as China's tensions with India and India's tensions with China. So those are just 3 examples from the sort of core Asian region where there's potential for climate-related, environmental, let's say, related conflict. But let me just spotlighting on the Iran geography with its neighbors. So if you look at the temperatures in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Jordan, these countries actually, total population of well over roughly 100-something million people that are already severely climate stressed, with no hope of climate change or climate mitigation on its current trajectory doing any good for them. Fiscally stressed countries, technologically unsophisticated countries that are not doing enough to implement water desalination, which is very expensive, even if they have the energy resources for it. These populations are going to push northward into eastern Turkey. Now, Turkey is already the country that hosts more refugees than any other country in the world. Turkey, Pakistan, now Poland, though hopefully that would be temporary. But Turkey really is the collecting point for a huge number of refugees in the world. And that's before one really takes into account. We attribute the conflicts and the exodus from Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere to politics. But now imagine climate change and its impact on international migration. And you're talking about, very, obviously very long set of borders that Turkey has with Syria, with Iraq / Kurdistan, and with Iran. So I can envision a large number of future climate refugees moving northward into this eastern Anatolian region. And I have a whole section of the book about it because I consider it to be the collection point, literally one of the junctions of global demographic movement, because the irony of ironies being that it is the same region, it's an incredibly verdant, livable, water-rich region of the world, Eastern Turkey, and yet it's been depopulating as Eastern Anatolian farmers and others have moved westward towards Ankara and Istanbul and so forth. So in a way, one of the zones in the world that is most predictably, environmentally, ecologically stable and suitable for human habitation is completely depopulating before our very eyes. And unlike, say, Russia, which is very far away, Canada, which is very far away, Norway, which is very far away, this is happening in the country that already hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, that clearly, whether it likes it or not, has porous borders. And so the next story maybe goes back to your very first question. The story that must be written and should be written in advance is the Persians and Arabs that are becoming climate refugees in Eastern Turkey, because I view that as inevitable as the sun rising in the east, quite frankly. And I've spent a fair bit of time in that region as well. And I don't say it with any pleasure, but I've made multiple trips to this, sort of seemingly to us, perhaps remote part of Turkey, but it's not so remote that it isn't actually one of the most central geographies on the entire planet, right? Yeah. Because that's exactly what it is. So the mismatch between our psychological attention to these key geographies and transit points and their climate suitability and the number of refugees that are already there, this is not a difficult connection to make. And it deserves a lot more attention because it's happening already.
Parag, thanks so much for those insights. We are running against time here, Laurie. I was thinking if we can wrap up with a question, and if I have time after that, maybe I'll pose the same question for the others as well. If there was one thing you think the world could do more of or do differently when it comes to climate action, such that the future would be more secure in all the writings you've done and edited, what would that be?
It's a hard one. I mean, I would argue in some ways it's about education, and not just for young people, but for all ages. But I think in some ways it's this idea that relates to just what we've been talking about here about resilience as a focus, because what we do know for sure from COVID and from this war with Ukraine and Russia is that the shocks come when you don't expect them and from directions you didn't expect. And that what we need to do actually is just build up and look at very brittle systems that have not served us well through this, that have created problems for everyone, and think, how do we make those more resilient? How do we prepare societies? And I think that is around things that you don't always think about, like social protection systems. I think that a lot of it is about looking to who the real experts in adaptation are, and they are not in the global north. Some of the best ideas in the world come out of the global south, because it's the people that are actually dealing with the problem that have the experience. They're the ones that should be flying around the world, if anybody's going to do that, giving advice to others rather than global north people coming in and offering suggestions. I think
note, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we are racing.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Time over here. But that was a very, very profound note, I thought, to sort of grab and end this conversation here. It is 8:30 Singapore time. Amazing how time flies. So I just want to thank you all. This has been extremely informative and knowledgeable, and I know many of us would want to stay on and discuss further. Thank you, Parag, for your valuable insights, Laurie, for all your tips, and Sherelle for your passion and your dedication to this topic. Once again, folks, joining us today on the panel, Parag Khanna, strategy advisor and author, Laurie Gehring, who is the TRF climate editor, and Sherelle Jackson, who has woken up way early to join us today, and she is from the Pacific Islands. Thank you very, very much, everyone, and see you next time. Next Tuesday, we are going to be having another webinar, and this time we're going to be discussing an equally important topic on tackling inequality. So we're going to be focusing on social inclusion as well as empowerment. There is bad, but folks, there's also a lot of good happening in this world. Thank you for joining today. We'll be back next Tuesday. Bye for now.